Let's get more now on the pulling down of the statue of the Bristol slave trader Edward Colston during a Black Lives Matter protest, and whether the presence of historical monuments of controversial figures should be challenged. Should they be removed? Well, joining me now to discuss this from Washington is Lucia Araujoa, Professor of History at Howard University and author of Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past. Also from Sheffield is Dr. Remi Adekoya, teacher of politics and author of Biracial Britain, A Different Way of Looking at Race. And very good to talk to you both. And if I could start with you, Professor Araujoa, I mean, were you glad to see the back of Mr. Colston?
Yes, I was glad to see. It was a big surprise yesterday. I was on Twitter when I saw the statue being removed by that big crowd. The monument has been contested since the 1990s. There were many initiatives to contextualize the monument and either to remove it, or we had also several interventions on that monument. And eventually, with all that is going on, different groups decided to take the fate of the monument in their own hands and take it down.
Well, Dr. Adekoya, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, there is a counter-argument saying, as was touched on there by Professor Araujoa, that say, well, leave it up. And we're talking about it. If there was no evidence of Edward Colston, perhaps people wouldn't know about this history.
Well, I think there's three sort of aspects to this issue. First of all, there's the law and order aspect, which I don't think should be dismissed. So that's the aspect which says we shouldn't destroy, nobody should destroy public property. No individuals or any group of individuals should destroy public property. And I get that argument, and that's a legitimate argument. Then there's the historical context argument, which says, well, we shouldn't judge people today by our moral standards of today, but we should judge historical figures by the moral standards of the times in which they lived. That's the second aspect of an argument. But then there's also the moral argument. And honestly speaking, despite the fact that I've taken into consideration those first two arguments and don't dismiss them, morally, I definitely find it difficult in me to sort of muster outrage at the toppling of the statue of someone who engaged or who profited from the perpetration of human misery, which slavery definitely was, even taking into consideration all that context which we had prior to that. The positive, I hope, will emerge from this is that it helps us to sort of open a discussion and sort of re-examine British history, not in a way that is meant to put anybody down or to make any group of people sort of feel bad, not in a debate that is supposed to get into a, sort of black people good, white people bad kind of a debate. That's not what we want, but an open and frank debate in which everybody respects the other side's opinions. We try to put ourselves in the shoes of others, but generally try to establish certain sort of moral common ground and move forward based on that.
And Professor Araujoa, it has, as we heard there, it's got people discussing. I guess there's more people Googling the history of British Empire and slavery than for quite a while.
Yes, I can understand that, because the event that we saw yesterday in Bristol was not an isolated event. We saw then interventions in statues in Belgium, King Leopold II. We saw in Portugal. Then, of course, you are seeing these interventions here in the United States with the Confederate monuments. And we understand that these statues, these monuments are artifacts that were placed in a particular moment in particular places, very often just considering the presence of Black populations in cities such as Bristol or Liverpool or London. And I believe that the very presence of these artifacts that do not belong there anymore, do not educate the population about the slave trade past of Britain or Portugal or the Netherlands. Then at some point, of course, there were attempts to contextualize that. It wasn't possible. And now with all this debate, that is not about the past. What you are debating here is not the slave past of the cities or the activities of these slave traders, But what you are debating now is the racial inequalities and racism and white supremacy that continues to damage and to harm the populations of African descent in all the societies. And this is when these monuments, they are doing more harm than good.
Okay,
And
more
this
harm
is
than
why
good.
people are Googling that.
Oh, all right. Well, so
More
Dr.
harm. No, yes.
Yeah, I just want to get Dr. Adekoya's thoughts on that. I mean, do you think you can leave them where they are? Or what about, let me put you the kind of post-communist solution in many countries after the Berlin Wall came down and the collapse of the Soviet domination of that huge region, where so many statues were removed, some of them pulled down, but many of them have then been put in sculpture parks and places like that where you can discuss that history in context.
Sure, and we can, talk about the technicalities of how this should be handled and how this statute should be handled. I would argue that I think the bigger point here is this is essentially, I'd say, a cry for a historical debate about Britain, about things which happened in the past and how those things, including colonialism, slavery, etc., might have effects on people today. I think that is essentially what this is a demand for, rather than sort of focusing on the statues themselves. And I think if this debate is held in an open fashion, without malice, with the assumption of good intentions on every side, then this could be something which helps us to move forward rather than something which divides us.
And the fact is, it's an old cliche, isn't it, Professor Araujo? But history tends, by and large, to be written by the victors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's true. And I think that either scholars, activists, the students, they have been fighting to contextualize and to tell the entire history of this tragic period for a very long time. And they did that in democratic ways, then by calling politicians to take action, to contextualize these monuments. And up to this day, nothing was done. Then what you are seeing perhaps is an extreme solution, but it is a response to the silence that has been there for a very long time. Of course, that each city, each country has its particularities, let's say that way. But at the same time, each community is deciding what is better to do with these monuments.
But Dr. Adekoya, what about, I mean, with Edward Colston, it's pretty clear cut, isn't it? A slave trader who waxed fat on human lives and human misery. But we've also seen Winston Churchill targeted questions about Oliver Cromwell, where it's a bit more nuanced, isn't it? Of course, Winston Churchill was a major figure in protecting and defending and extending, if he could, the British Empire. But of course, we all know about his role in the Second World War. Oliver Cromwell, British parliamentary democracy, gets all, I suppose, an awful lot of its wellspring comes from him. But of course, there was a genocidal campaign, more or less, in Ireland.
Of course, and historical figures are incredibly difficult to sort of, decipher and, portray in black or white frames, of course, and we should discuss each of them separately. I mean, there's a whole history around Mahatma Gandhi, who later became a great leader, fighter for justice, who made horribly racist remarks about black people earlier in his career in South Africa. That doesn't mean today we say Gandhi was a bad person. On the contrary, but it should be, we should discuss, the things he said. And history, history can be incredibly complicated. So I'll tell you a short story which might surprise some people. So in Lagos, Nigeria, the city where I grew up, there's a statue of a lady, Madame Tinubu, who was a Nigerian slave trader in the 1800s, okay? She started out as a slave trader, made a lot of money from slave trading, then later actually became part of the anti-colonial resistance and is remembered today as a hero by Nigerians and has her monument in Lagos, the commercial capital of Nigeria, even though she also engaged in the trade of slaves. So these things are horribly complicated, and very often there's no sort of black or white picture, but we should discuss them in the cases where we can determine, I'd say, by a moral consensus that, look, this isn't somebody whose statue should be out there, because at the end of the day, when people's statues are out there, it sends a message to people. It's essentially telling us, who are the kind of people we want to emulate, okay, in our society. So this matters, I don't agree with those who say it doesn't matter. It matters, but we should have contextualized discussions. We shouldn't have discussions in which we sort of, one side might feel that the other side just wants to sort of put them on the psychological defensive, put them on the moral defensive all the time. It's not about white guilt. It shouldn't be about white guilt. It should be about us having an honest conversation, as I said, going in, with goodwill, but we just want to discuss certain things, and it does need to be the psychological effects which people feel about seeing statues like that, knowing that, this was somebody who sold people like my ancestors into slavery, and there he is, his statue is there. It affects people, and we should get why that happens.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we are out of time for this contextualized discussion, but thank you both very much indeed, Dr. Adekoya and Professor Araujoa. Very good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, China's response to the coronavirus